Thank you for inviting me to Detroit. I came from Beirut yesterday, and I'm returning to Beirut tomorrow on the 6:32 flight to Paris. I arrive in Beirut on Monday. On Wednesday, I'm flying to Istanbul. And on Friday night, I'm going to be in Taksim Square in the centre of Istanbul, where a few brave Armenians and brave Turks are joining together to commemorate your genocide. I'm going to speak to you very frankly this evening, and I hope you won't be too shocked by me, but I'm going to tell you that actually I'm not sure how interested I am in what you're going to do this 24th of April, this 100th anniversary. I am interested in what you're going to do on the day afterwards. I want to talk about evidence, and I want to talk about photographic evidence, and I want to talk about the present-day Middle East. But I think, first of all, 30 years ago I started talking as well as writing for my newspaper. It lets me meet the readers, of course. But on top of that, I've had this idea that I've constantly written about and constantly suggested, and many Armenians have said, what a great idea, and nothing ever happens. And I'm a journalist, not an activist, I'm not a politician. But I said many years ago, why don't you honour the brave Turks who risked their lives to save even a few of you during the genocide? I haven't yet found a Turk among the audiences of Armenians when I've spoken to them. I still want to. I want to see Turks among you. It's always been my idea that if you could have some kind of commemorative document listing the names of one of the Turkish Ottoman governors who saved many thousands of Armenians, of individual policemen who are named in the original Bryce report produced by the British Foreign Office. List those brave Turkish men who tried to save the honour of their nation in that nation's most sinful hour. And then perhaps ask the Turkish leadership to sign this document in honour of their brave Turkish fellow countrymen. Could they refuse? I get very tired of this thing about how we can't call it a genocide. Of course, I always do and you do. In fact, my newspaper is the only one I know in the world that calls it the Armenian Holocaust and uses that word with a capital H, by the way. I remember once our sub-editor one of our sub-editors put a small h. And an Armenian friend of mine rang me up and said, didn't enough of us die, Robert, to qualify for the capital H? What is this fear of using the word genocide? Wasn't it, I'm going to quote here, this is Barack Obama. We'll all be waiting to see what he says. Is he as brave as the Pope, I wonder? This is Barack Obama, I'm talking about this Friday. Here's Barack Obama on the 19th of January 2008. The Armenian genocide is not an allegation, a personal opinion or a point of view, but rather a widely documented fact supported by an overwhelming body of historical evidence. The facts are undeniable. As a senator, I strongly support the passage of the Armenian Genocide Resolution, and as president, I will recognise the Armenian genocide. Ho, ho, ho. Let's just see what happens on the 24th of April. I'll have my little radio set on when I'm in Istanbul, believe me. It's funny, that word genocide. I mean, what is it? The Turks claim, all right, well, we can't use the word genocide because it wasn't invented then. Now, my father, who was much older than my mum, he was in the First World War. But in the First World War, they didn't call it the First World War. They didn't even know it was the first one. But does that mean the First World War didn't happen? Yes, we can all play these linguistic games, Here's a little document drawn up by someone in the British Foreign Office. Confidential, of course. The date is the 10th of April 2006. Blair was the most spineless of our Prime Ministers. The worst tragedy that ever happened to Britain. But this is the kind of rubbish that the Foreign Office was putting out during the Blair period. By the way, if anyone can explain to me afterwards Blair's relationship with God, you get $10. I mean, you would have thought maybe God gave him advice sometimes, like, you know, Tony, this Iraq thing may not be such a good idea. But let me just tell you what the Foreign Office is putting out as advice to the British government within the last 10 years. And if you want to know, this is a civil servant whose name was Michael Attenborough. It has proved extremely difficult to disentangle the truth, and the issues, problems of history, for example, remain the subject of considerable controversy. How weary I am at listening to this rubbish. Observers are far from unanimous as to whether the massacres and deaths that occurred during the deportations constitute an official campaign of genocide. Then it goes on, the British government's position on the issue of the events of 1915-16 has been reiterated on many occasions. Officially, the government acknowledges the strength of feeling, you feel things, you see, about what it describes as a terrible episode of history. By the way, I did notice that Congressman Trott, and you noticed it too, who has of course signed the letter to the President, didn't use the word genocide on that videotape, did he? No, he called the tragic events again. I know, I spotted it. I don't know why. I did say, I'll be frank with you. However, I'm going back to the British Foreign Office, Mr. Michael Attenborough, neither the current government nor previous British governments have judged that the evidence is sufficiently unequivocal to persuade it that these events should be characterised as genocide. What about the Price report? It was printed by the British Foreign Office. And so it goes on. It's wearying for me to read this. This is a highly emotive issue. Of course, 1.5 million dead is highly emotive, isn't it? Which provokes strongly held and often polarised views. The Turks disagree and we mustn't offend them. Accounts of the period of history in question are by no means clear-cut. Well, there isn't a mass grave with a marker on top of it, I suppose. And as with any such situation, there are differing interpretations. I'm not going to weary you with any more of this nonsense. I remember how poor old George Hintlian, the wonderful Armenian historian in Jerusalem, was telling me and explaining to me how the Israelis would never acknowledge officially from the government that it was a genocide committed by the Turks, because at that stage Turkish-Israeli relations were rather good. And then suddenly, after we had the bust-up in relations between Jerusalem and Ankara, the Israelis started talking about, officially on television, all Israelis know and acknowledge, of course, it was a genocide, about the genocide. And I remember George Hintlian saying to me in Jerusalem that year, he said, you know, suddenly all the official Israelis want to talk about our genocide. He said, we've been upgraded. But seriously, one of the things I think that you have to think much more about today, much more than you have in the past, is what Eric was talking about, and that is documentation, documentation, documentation. After the 100th anniversary is over, don't say, OK, we made it, people understand. You are winning, ladies and gentlemen. You're getting there with your recognition of the genocide. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. A couple of years ago, the Turks published, my Turkish publisher published, a full, uncut version of my book, The Great War for Civilization, with its long chapter on the Armenian Genocide, the title of which is The First Holocaust. I checked the Turkish translation with an Armenian who spoke fluent Turkish, of course, and it was perfect. And I went to launch that Turkish edition in Turkey. I went on 21 television and radio shows, and only once before the programme began did anyone challenge me about the genocide. Otherwise, nobody did. And on the last day I was in Istanbul, I was at the Turkish Book Fair. And there was a long, crowded line of people that had seen me on TRT, Turkish state television, the previous night, talking about the Armenian genocide and calling it a genocide. And at one point, a young man came up to me and wanted me to sign the book. And he said, my dad saw you on television last night. He wants you to dedicate it to him. I said, fine. I was signing away. And I said, by the way, who is your dad? And he said, he's the police chief of Istanbul. You are winning, ladies and gentlemen. You'll get it. But let's go back to what I call the documents. There are still, as Eric says, many documentary and filmic evidence of the genocide which we haven't yet discovered. My old friend Hake at the Yerevan Genocide Museum has found a wonderful new source. I'll tell you exactly the details of it because it's fascinating. It tells you about modern history. As you know, a number of German and indeed Austrian army officers serving with the Turkish army to train them in 1915 did take pictures. Armin Wegner is the most obvious one. Although, by the way, later in the Second World War he became a fascist hunting for Jews in Italy, which we don't mention too much, I'm sure. But you should know that Wegner does not have a perfect reputation. Nonetheless, what Hake told me is that when they took the photographs, and there were many of them, the Germans, in their little box cameras, you know, the high-tech of the time, the YouTube of the time, at the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire surrendered, they returned and were given safe passage back to Berlin. And their photographs of people being led away, of Armenians still in their towns, or of bodies, were put in photograph albums. Pass on now to 1945, and the Red Army storms into Hitler's Berlin and loots everything from donkeys to tramcars to photo albums. And Hake has found some photographs from the genocide in Moscow. You see the route: Erzurum, Berlin, Moscow, Yerevan. And he's gathering these pictures in painstakingly to maintain the importance of new historical evidence. I'm chasing what I think is a bit of real footage, I mean moving film, taken of dying Armenians. I think I know where it is because in Anjar in Lebanon there's a photograph in the memorial chapel of a French military photographer with a movie camera. And I think I've found the right reel of film in French archives. But my goodness, it's taken me years and quite a lot of my money flying around to try and find it. There are pictures in Maryland, in the United States here, of dying Armenians at Smyrna in 22, which have not been shown and seen, but I've found them with the help of an Armenian friend in New York. So I'm just saying there are things out there. You take, for example, in Britain, last year, a young man, or a middle-aged man now, found that his father had left him private papers of his time in the Armenian area in 1918, at the end of the First World War, when of course the massacres were still going on and the refugees were there. They've just published for the first time their fathers, it's two brothers actually, their father's own memoirs of being a soldier, a British officer at that time. Not an Armenian, not a German, but a British officer. So, you know, the Turks have to say, well, can they explain this guy? Let me just read from this new document. He is, by the way, up on the Iraqi border. He's not in Syria, he's across. A member of what was then called Dunster Force. Eric can explain that to you. About this time, we began to pass many thousands of Armenians who were refugees. By the way, the man's name is Alec Glenn. His book's been published as In the Front Line, A Doctor in War and Peace. About this time, we began to pass many thousands of Armenians who were refugees. Sometimes we will pass several thousand in a day. It was an amazing and tragic sight. There were old men and women and children, some riding on donkeys and some riding on cows. The younger ones walked and pushed barrows with their belongings. Now and then we passed at the roadside a dying person, or one already dead and half eaten by dogs and jackals. We could do nothing for them, but we lifted some of the younger ones who looked as if they might recover onto the mules and carry them forward to the next village. My soldiers had arranged posts in most of the villages where rations were handed out to the refugees, and some primitive arrangements were made for looking after the sick. Salisbury Craig, my fellow medical officer, told me later that he attended an old refugee in the road who, before he died, gave him a leather belt full of sovereigns, which he asked him to spend to help the other refugees. Greater love hath no man than that. So what I'm trying to say to you is, we've got to keep going after the documents. Mr. Kelechian, my old Armenian friend in California, managed to dig up the old 1926 memoirs of a lady called Halida Adivar, the feminist Turkish lady of her day, and a conversation she had on a railway train with Talat Pasha, the organizer of your people's persecution. She spoke to him, of course, of what I regard and you regard as the 20th century's first Holocaust. And she recalled how he almost lost his temper when discussing the deportations, as she put it. "Look here, Halida," Talat Pasha said, "I have a heart as good as yours, and it keeps me awake at night to think of the human suffering. But that is a personal thing, and I am here on this earth to think of my people and not of my sensibilities. There was an equal number of Turks and Muslims massacred in the Balkan War, yet the world kept a criminal silence. I have the conviction that as long as a nation does the best for its own interests and succeeds, the world admires it and thinks it moral. I am ready to die for what I have done, and I know that I shall die for it." That could have been written by Hitler, couldn't it? That was spot on. That was the truth. Even now I'm still getting real documents, new to prove the truth of the genocide. Here's a lady who wrote to me, Patricia Brooks from England, whose grandmother was Armenian. She was referring, this is written to me on the 14th of October 2013, less than 2 years ago. She's referring to an article I'd written about the genocide, and she goes on, "My grandparents were in Czechoslovakia, and they went east to Baghdad, Aleppo, Beirut, Alexandria, Cairo. They were musicians. In 1915-16, Papa was called up to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army, other members of my family in the Ottoman army. And while he was away, my grandmother lived in either Aleppo or Beirut. It's not clear. It was learned that the Turks were coming, massacring Christians. And my grandmother's neighbour, a Jewish lady, rushed round her and gave her a Star of David to wear. When the knock on the door came, my grandmother opened it and brandished the Star of David round her neck. She wasn't touched by the Turks." A new story no one has ever heard before. And suddenly there it is, out of the British mail system. So we've got to go after, again and again, this documentary evidence. Now, in this context, I want just to say to you that one of the important things about the Armenian Genocide of 1915 was the deliberation and the precision that lay behind it. We have the idea that these murderous gangs that slaughtered your people were somehow crazed. Well, they were. Stabbing and killing and destroying and burning churches. All true, but there was a brain behind it, like there is a brain behind ISIS. The planning of the genocide was immaculate. It was perfect. They knew where each convoy was going and where it would disintegrate. And that is the documents, which, as Eric said, they exist all over the world now, in different translations, particularly German documentation. In Yabrud, I went into the Church of the Sacred Virgin, and I found that the Nusra and ISIS fighters there had gone around the church where there was a whole strips of large mosaics of the saints, and they had, with a drill, with a knife, gouged out the eyes of all the saints in the mosaics. There was even a picture of St. George killing the dragon, and they had gouged out St. George's eyes, and they gouged out the dragon's eyes as well. What did ISIS have against dragons? But now here's the point. When I got inside the church, and there were unexploded mines lying around, you see, set for the Syrian army, I had a bomb disposal officer from the Syrian military with me. And we gingerly went up the aisle, watching for wires hanging down. And at the end, next to the altar, the Nusra ISIS people had sliced up the oil paintings of the Greek saints. I bring you this from the front line. There are plenty of genocides going on today. This is one of those strips of the painted saints. You can see their eyes here. But what I point out to you about this is not just the evidence of yet more anti-Christian sectarianism, but look how neatly he cut this. It is absolutely precision. This wasn't done by a man with a knife going mad. This was done by a man who either had a machine or who took a strange delight in the perfection of doing things like a machine. Just as the Ottoman Turks kill you with great precision. So there's a brain behind ISIS, and there was a brain behind the genocide. I say this again and again to you. You know, there are parallels. I once dug up the bones and skulls of Armenians at Hurghada, north of Deir ez-Zor, and I put the bones and skulls which I found in the church at Deir ez-Zor. And a few weeks ago at Kamishli, I spoke to the senior Armenian churchman who told me that Nusra had gone into the church and thrown all the bones there into the street before they blew the church up. There is a photograph you may have seen of the church after destruction. There's something strange that connects that past of 1915 to what I see with my eyes now in the same deserts where your people died by the hundreds of thousands. How to perpetuate forever the uniqueness of a genocide, of a Holocaust? You know, I think that up to now, the survivors of both Holocausts of the last century, the Armenians and the Jews, have emphasized quite correctly the uniqueness of the persecution of their people. I've had many discussions with Jews about how they will continue the memory of their Holocaust in 30 years' time, when, like you, they have the deep sadness of seeing their last survivors dying. Will it be enough in the future? Do we remember the Huguenots today? Do we remember the victims of Genghis Khan? No. I'm afraid not. As Eric said, it is the fact that we're all going to die. But how do we uniquely remember your people and the Jewish people who died, and not sideline it as a sectarian issue? Oh, well, they were Armenians. Well, they were Jews. Of course Hitler was killing the Jews. It's true. They were. But after years of interviewing Armenian survivors and Jewish survivors of the 1939-45 genocide, I think more and more that we are going to have to see you not as Armenians, but as us. The first book my mother gave me to read as a little boy was The Diary of Anne Frank. Because, of course, Anne was a little girl, actually German, not Dutch, of course. She fled to Holland with her family because of the Nazis in Germany. And when you read her, it's like she's your sister, not someone from a different race or a different religion. And I've come to meet so many Armenian genocide survivors, including in Britain, my country, and see them, and as they tell their story, they are my friends. They're no longer Armenians. You know, the other, Oda, I think it is in Armenian. You're not Oda to me. And you must never become that to anyone. That's why there should be some Turks among you today. Because unless we see your people suffering as the suffering of human beings rather than Armenians, the memory of your genocide, even if you have it recognized in every country in the world, will fail. It will fade and it will fail. And it's when we can see you as us that you will really win. In Brighton some years ago, and this old lady died just over a year ago, no, 2 years ago, sorry, I spoke to an Armenian woman who remembered very well coming south into the desert of Syria with her mother. And she remembered very clearly, seeing with her own eyes the Turkish gendarmerie piling up babies, living babies, and setting them on fire. And her mother said to her, "Don't worry, the sound you can hear as they cry is their souls going up to heaven." Well, I say this to you. Those souls must always belong to all of us, not just to you. And the same applies to the victims of the Jewish Holocaust. The wickedness of genocide is that the people being killed are human beings just like you, me, my family. We're all the same. And that's the only way you'll perpetuate forever what happened to your people. Thank you for your patience tonight.